que lo voy a introducir en un momento. Les invitamos que tomen sus asientos y quiero agradecerles otra vez por estar aquí y en Salt Lake City. Yo pedí un favor de nuestro CEO Keith McMullen, que él viniera. Tiene un horario muy complicado, como sabe. Pero yo quiero introducir Keith. Él va a ofrecer unas palabras en un momento, pero quiero describir un poco de su biografía. Keith empezó su carrera con Ford Motor Company. Él ha servido como autoridad general de la iglesia como 70. También sirvió como consejero en el obispado principal de la iglesia. Hace 5 años fue nombrado CEO de Deseret Management Corporation, que incluye en su grupo Deseret News, Bonneville, que contiene las organizaciones de broadcast, KSL Radio, KSL TV y otras estaciones de radio en otras partes de los Estados Unidos. Deseret Book y Deseret Digital Media, donde pertenezco yo. Este año también ha servido como presidente del Salt Lake City Chamber of Commerce. Deseret Management Corporation ha dado su apoyo firmemente por muchos años, que me ha hecho posible el servicio aquí en la CIP. Y por esto les agradecemos mucho. Además, Deseret Management Corporation ha brindado el soporte mayor por esta asamblea en Salt Lake City. Por mi parte personal, en el nombre de la CIP, ofrecemos agradecimiento a usted y a Deseret Management Corporation por su apoyo y por su valor institucional de ser un campeón de la libertad. Keith, I offered a brief introduction, and I thanked you for your personal support, for my service in this organization, and for the DMC's generous support of the Inter-American Press Association, and in particular, the generous support that you've offered in hosting this assembly here in Utah, which by all accounts has been very well received and appreciated. So I would like to invite you to come and offer a few words, and thank you once again for your generous support.
It's a genuine privilege for me to be here with you today and to have been with you at some of the other events of this particular convention. The connections of Utah and Utahns with the Hispanic world are quite deep. For example, in my personal circumstance, I spent 18 years almost as one of the leading divisions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and my assignment for most of that time was to the Latin countries. And though I don't speak Spanish, I gained a deep love for the Latin people, the countries, and the growth of those countries over the decades that I have been able to observe firsthand. Furthermore, this part of the world, Utah, has an interesting image that is projected around the world. Wherever one goes across the breadth of this earth, if he or she is from Utah, the immediate connection is, aha, Mormon. And then there's some explanation as to what the Mormon Church is and, more importantly, what it is not, because of misunderstandings across the world. Furthermore, if one is traveling from Utah and introduces himself or herself as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or Mormon, the immediate aha is Utah. This state and those people, known as Mormons, are inextricably connected. One cannot separate them. When one thinks of Utah, one thinks of the Mormon Church. When one thinks of Mormons, one thinks of Utah. And as you well know from your various countries, there are differing perceptions about both Utah and the Mormon Church. When we learned that IAPA was interested in having its convention here, we thought to ourselves, what a wonderful privilege for Utah to deepen its ties to the Hispanic world and for the Hispanic leaders, men and women who are represented in this great convention, to come and see what Utah is all about. Now, with respect to our common interests, much has been said during the time that you have been convened about religious freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the Declaration of Chapultepec and the items set forth there in its 10 principles. I thought it might be of interest, though we will make it brief, for you to see how some of those interests of IAPA and the culture of Utah are intertwined. First of all, in the Declaration of Chapultepec, those 10 principles underscore a basic belief in many, many respects that we as Utahns hold dear. The opportunity, as you heard last Saturday evening, to express ourselves and to hold our opinions and views inviolate by from government interference or other influences is something that we respect and hold as a God-given and inalienable right. We find that compatible with the declaration and principles to which I have referred. When in 1847 the pioneers moved into this valley, it was with a credo that they claimed to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience, and were determined to allow other men and women to do so unencumbered by whatever biases that might be present. That particular principle is woven through the fabric of Utah and its people. And you will find that we vigorously defend the right of free expression, of free assembly, and the freedom of religion. In addition, Deseret Management Corporation, which holds a number of different communication businesses, already referred to by Mr. Saunders, businesses involved in news and opinion, commentary, in broadcast, both in radio and in television, in the digital world where we reach across the breadth of the earth and have hundreds of millions of followers of those things which we share, in publishing where we produce materials both digitally and in the printed form for families and individuals who find these kinds of materials that we produce important to their family and their own personal intimate settings. We are vitally interested in these freedoms to which I have made reference because they undergird the very activities in which we are engaged. I thought, therefore, that it might be helpful to you in my brief remarks to share with you the undergirding foundation of Deseret Management Corporation and its broadcast entities. First of all, our mission is to be trusted voices of light and truth. We are not simply interested in putting out messages. We do some of that, to be sure, but our real purpose is to put out messages of truth, messages that lift and improve the human family, hence our mission statement. We have some foundation stones that underlie that mission statement, which I will mention but briefly. The truths that we put out, we hope will build faith in God the Eternal Father, whom we believe firmly is the Father of the human family, and we, as His children, are brothers and sisters populating this earth. We understand that the purposes of our mission include proclaiming those truths that help the human family wed and weld themselves more closely together, as a family should be. Our messages are designed to strengthen families. The family, in our view, is the foundation of society. And when fathers, mothers, and children are strong, societies, economies, and people are strong. Therefore, much of what we put out over our broadcast and publishing vehicles is focused on strengthening the family in its local setting. We pride ourselves in being champions of freedom. We believe, as I have already articulated, that men and women have a God-given right to choose for themselves, and that agency is fundamental to the growth of individuals. Therefore, we strive diligently to protect that, advocate for it, and in the context of so doing, we are determined ourselves to do so in harmony with not only the laws of God, but the laws of man. Our broadcast and publishing efforts are designed to promote virtue. In a world that is proud of values, we find that there is something eternal and purposeful in the depiction of values in the context of being virtues. In other words, we simply think that there are those things that are eternal in their nature and not necessarily subject to human definition. Virtues such as integrity, honesty, self-reliance, work, self-sufficiency, the things that make human beings strong, families strong, and society strong. Lastly, we seek through that which we do to motivate service, to cause people to marshal to the well-being of other peoples. We value human life and we value human rights, and we want to see those who read and consume our materials to be motivated to provide the kind of service that will preserve those attributes within the human family. Now, inasmuch as you have come and you have seen, you will go away and remember what you have felt and what you have heard here in Salt Lake City, Utah. We are known here in Utah for large families. I myself have a large family. We have 8 children, 27 grandchildren, and we wish we had many more. As families, we like to get together. We call them reunions. We would hope as you leave, as this convention comes to a close, you would say to yourselves, that experience has been a good one. The things that we have heard and seen while in Utah have been not only uplifting and edifying, but somewhat enlightening and informative. And we look forward to you coming back as a reunion. Thank you once again for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Keith. It's my honor today to introduce our panelists who have come from far away to join us. We're going to be conducting this in English, so if you need translation devices, please go ahead and seek them. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize Don Salazar, who is the chairman of the board of directors of the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, who's joined us today as well. So thank you. Thank you, Don. Don also happens to be a Utah resident. So like you saw last night with Rumba Libre, our music, we have a little bit of everything in Utah. So a bit surprising for some. Let me begin by introducing Javier Palomarez. Javier is he has a very long bio, and it's very impressive. And it was a treat and an honor for us to have him come and join us with his busy schedule, as you might imagine, representing chambers of commerce across this country. He's the current president and executive director of the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, which is the country's largest Hispanic business association. He's a pioneer in multicultural marketing. He has more than 2 decades of corporate experience and in business vision. His opinions and points of view have appeared in the most important news media of the United States, both in the printed press and in television and news agencies. And I've observed Javier in action in previous meetings, and he is an able leader and a passionate one in the causes associated with Hispanic families in the United States. Part of why we wanted Javier to come is that no Hispanic family in the United States is lacking family in your country. I've learned from you that in some cases 20 to 30% of your traffic comes from the United States, comes from families who have left their homes in Venezuela, Cuba, Argentina, Ecuador, and live here in this country. And his work is with those people who have come from your countries. And we've also observed in our media operation that this may be the first immigration wave in the history of the world that maintains immediate and close ties to the home country and to their families via Facebook, WhatsApp, and all other means of communication. So in many respects, the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce is part of a hemispheric tie that we now have in the Americas, which I think we should increasingly consider to be the case. So I really appreciate Javier being here. I'll introduce Natalie now as well, and then I'll invite each of them to give their own introductory remarks, and then we'll turn this into a discussion and would invite you to offer some of your questions as well. Natalie I've known for some time. She's one of the best and brightest of Utah and has been recognized as such in many settings. She's an economist by training and has a passion for the public policies that promote equilibrium, civility, and prosperity. She's the current Associate Dean of the Business School of the University of Utah and the Director of the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute, which was just formed with much acclaim in about 3 years ago. Is that right? And they do tremendous work to continue our thinking about how Utah as an economy, as a society, as a people continues to prosper and grow in the ways that were outlined by Keith McMullen. She was Associate Administrator in the United States Environmental Protection Agency and also consultant in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She shares her points of view in regular columns published in the Utah Press. And I must also note that at some personal sacrifice, she returned from a week-long trade mission with the governor last evening. And so you'll see her bright mind on display despite perhaps her weary body. So we're very glad to have Natalie here. So I'll turn some time over to each of them to introduce themselves and share some initial thoughts.
Do you want me to start? Yeah. Buenos dias. My name's Javier Palomarez, as was just mentioned. I represent the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, which in turn represents 4.2 million Hispanic-owned firms in this country. Those firms collectively contribute over $668 billion to the American economy. We do our work through a network of 200 local chambers all over the United States and Puerto Rico, to include a chamber right here in Utah. We are supported by 274 major American corporations. So from American Airlines to AT&T to Bank of America to Comerica, Chase, Dell, Exxon, Ford, GM, Goldman Sachs, all the way to Zion's Bank. They are all members of the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and they support our work. You should know that we are perhaps the only Hispanic organization in Washington that refuses to take money from any government entity of any sort. And we do that so that we can speak our mind unfettered and opine. And we think that it is important that American small business have a voice and share their opinions and be part of the national dialogue. And so it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Matthew, and everyone else. And it's a real honor to be here alongside somebody as acclaimed and absolutely fantastic as Natalie. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Great. Good morning. Having just returned from Israel, I thought I might say shalom to everyone. And I'm delighted to be with you, Javier, as well. I have been a fan of this guy for many years. I've followed some of the things he's written, and you're always welcome in Salt Lake City. As Matt mentioned, I am an associate dean at the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah. The University of Utah is our flagship university in this state. We are a Research One institution. We have a medical school, a lot of incredible faculty who do amazing research that makes our world a better place. I also lead this Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute. So if you think of every great place needs some place where thought leadership occurs. If you're in Washington, D.C., it's Brookings, it's the American Enterprise Institute. If you're in Colorado, it's the Aspen Institute. If you're in California, it might be the Hoover Institute. And the Gardner Policy Institute is that place here in Utah. And so I'm looking forward to sharing my observations with you about this interesting topic. And just on a personal note, I'm a native Salt Laker. After our session, if you have any questions about Utah, I can fill you in. Keith mentioned that we are a young state, a family-oriented state. We have about just over 3 million people here. Our economy is among the strongest in the United States. And where we are right now, we're about 500 yards from the lead hotel for the 2002 Olympic Winter Games, the Grand America next door. And our state has just formed an exploratory committee to go after the 2026 or 2030 Winter Olympics. So I hope that's a helpful tidbit. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you both. The panel's topic today is the new trade relationship between northern and southern hemispheres. We've had questions with respect to the new Trump administration about their trade doctrine. I've heard from a variety of different stakeholders about their perspective on the Trump trade doctrine, from his interest in bilateral discussions with the president of Peru to more recently a conversation that I had in a panel at the Organización de Telecomunicaciones de Iberoamérica in Miami, at which the Secretary of State of Mexico was the key speaker, Luis Videgaray. And he spoke a bit about current state of affairs in Mexico, and which are in some parts troublesome, in some parts encouraging. And then immediately the conversation turned toward NAFTA. And his response was something in the following nature. He expressed that NAFTA is indeed a dated agreement that was negotiated decades ago and enforced a couple of decades ago. That when the Trump administration first came in, they were very difficult to deal with, but that in recent months, and this was as of late May, they had begun making a lot of progress. We asked him why, and he said, Jared Kushner, because of working with Jared Kushner. First and foremost, I'd like to ask, from your perspectives, what are the aspects of NAFTA that both Mexico and the United States see as maybe not see in the same way, but do see some aspects of NAFTA as necessary to be reworked or rediscussed, renegotiated? Do you want to go first?
Okay, happy to. Matt, I want to just preface that just a tiny bit by giving just a little bit more context.
Please.
Is this okay?
Yes, please.
The context that I would want to share with you is that we have a president of the United States who has made every public statement oriented towards, I'm going to use his terminology, draining the swamp. That's a chilling statement, right? Because it's basically saying we have a federal government that he wants to go in and just change. Policies he wants to change. And he has called NAFTA, what, the worst trade deal ever in whatever colorful terms. So when you're a policy analyst, when you're a business leader, you have to take that information and you have to do something that I would just say is decoding of his words. What does he really mean? What is he saying? And I think that begins with an understanding of this person, our president, is he's a showman. He's a marketeer. He is very expressive. And it's the people behind him and around him that have to go do the substance of the work. And so my greatest optimism about this renegotiation is the notion that the people around the president will get through all of the bluster, if you will, and do the right thing. Matt's question was about, well, what's the right thing? But I thought I should first kind of set this context of, we are decoding this president. We are trying to take something that needs to happen, modernization of a, more than 3-decade-old or whatever, almost 3-decade-old trade deal, and improve it. And the places I'd like to see improvement are in e-commerce and in energy. But we'll go in more details on that, and I'll turn it over to Javier to maybe some additional color commentary.
Thank you, Natalie. So I think much in the same way that you did, I think it makes sense to put NAFTA in its proper context. The net effect of NAFTA to the United States has been a very positive one. As we stand, some 14 million American jobs depend on the trade that exists between these three very critical partners. You could certainly, to the point that Natalie made, certainly update the agreement. I think that is appropriate. Any piece of legislation that's nearly a quarter of a century old needs to be revisited. It should be recalibrated and brought up to date 21st century standards. But the reality of it is that that the net effect of NAFTA has been an incredible boon to the American economy, the American people. During the campaign, I had the opportunity to talk to Donald Trump about it. I had an opportunity to talk to Bernie Sanders about it, and everybody in between the two. Our association hosted a presidential candidate Q&A series, and I had the opportunity in front of the cameras to sit with Ted Cruz, with Jeb Bush, with Hillary Clinton, with Bernie Sanders, and several others that were running for president. And in fact, the only one who backed out at the last minute was, in fact, the president, who had insisted on being part of the Q&A series, and then 48 hours before he was to attend, he backed out. But we've had the opportunity to talk to his team, and I've personally had discussions with the likes of Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin, with Secretary of Energy Perry, with Secretary of Agriculture Perdue, with Ivanka and a few others on his team. And to the point that Natalie made, I think that is a bright spot, that there are people around him that in fact understand the machinations and what needs to exist in this important bilateral trade or in this important trade relationship. That NAFTA needs to be updated, there's no question. But this talk of tearing up NAFTA and throwing it away is not only bombastic, it's frankly, it's disruptive. And I have no doubt that that will not happen. I have no doubt that we will eventually come to the table and try to renegotiate it. But to the point that, again, Natalie made, it is critically important that we, as an association, continue to work with those around the president who see things more clearly and see it, frankly, the way we do. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. But on behalf of American business, we remain undaunted that this needs to be taken as seriously as it possibly can be, and we will continue to work to make sure that the right minds are around the table when we renegotiate this important agreement.
From each of your perspectives, Natalie, you mentioned e-commerce and energy, and you were talking about how the scrapping of, or the dismissing of NAFTA would be catastrophic. What are the aspects of NAFTA that more specifically would benefit the U.S. nationally, and then Utah specifically? What are the aspects of the improvement that we need to see, and then what are the greatest risks of disruption in this process from either point of view?
You know, Utah is an energy state. The U.S. energy market has changed dramatically in the last several years because of the fracking revolution. It changes everything for our country. And I know enough about Mexico to know how they are allowing greater foreign investment in energy markets there, which also changes everything. So that would be the first place I would start, is trying to think about how do you create a more integrated North American energy market that could raise living standards in all three countries. That would deal with, cross-border pipelines, cross-border transmission. It would deal with a lot of the paperwork that happens with these sorts of things. So that's just one example of where we could do something to modernize our relationships and create greater wealth and opportunity for the three countries.
Yeah, I think if you look at energy specifically, it's important to kind of lead with the facts. And unfortunately, facts are not as sexy sometimes as some of the rhetoric our president uses. But the reality of it is, if you look at Mexico and the United States, Mexico is our #1 energy trade partner. We export some $20 billion of energy goods to Mexico every year. If you look at our relationship to Canada, Canada is our #1 energy trade partner in terms of they're exporting energy goods to us, and it's roughly to the tune of $54 billion. If you look at the three countries combined and what it means to the American economy, energy alone for America in terms of this, this relationship with Canada and Mexico accounts for $100 billion of energy trade that happens every year in the United States. 40% of our energy exports go to one of these two partners. So it's critically important that we begin with the facts and recognize the important relationship and its impact not only on our economy, but the average American family. And I think when we can begin to grapple with those facts and remove the emotion perhaps and remove the campaign rhetoric, we can get at where we really need to work on NAFTA to make it better for all three partners, but certainly for America.
Fantastic. We're using NAFTA in some respects as the locus of analysis today. I want to ask a couple more questions about that, but then begin to extend our thinking about our conversation about the broader region as well. There have been about 24 countries represented here throughout the days that we've been together. Some of them have had to leave, but it's been a remarkable assembly. And each of them, as I've traveled in these countries, they are so trade-minded. They know the U.S. exchange rate, they know the Fed policies, they know what's happening, much more so than we do often. Is that not the case?
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very, very well-informed public from top to bottom. A part of that is that they're heavily dependent on inter-regional trade, but also very tend to be U.S. directing in many of their economic needs and trade needs. So first question, or a follow-on question around NAFTA, is what are the implications specifically, and you mentioned energy, but if NAFTA in particular were to be disrupted, what would be the greatest risk, Natalie, from your perspective to Utah? And associated with that, is the media characterizing the risks and benefit of this appropriately? So let's talk about the risks to disrupting trade relationships, and then.
Well, so I'm an economist who studies the Utah economy, and so I can speak directly about NAFTA and global trade as it relates to Utah. But everything I share kind of can be, pushed out to a national perspective as well, and I know Javier will get that part of it. The thing I like to think about is supply chains. All the interconnections, whether it's in manufacturing, agriculture, energy, the service sector, and I think you disrupt or mess around with the supply chain at your peril, right? Because the supply chain is based on markets and supply and demand, efficiencies, and to the extent that government action starts to get in the way of the free association of business that benefits markets, I think that we're at risk. So come back to Utah. We do a lot of work in airbags for automobiles. So we have a lot of relationships in Utah with Monterrey, Mexico, and other places in Mexico where the auto industry is so important. And it turns out, as we study those supply chains, we have things that leave Utah, go to Mexico, come back to Utah, get worked some more, and then go back to Mexico, and then come back to the US. That's a supply chain. And I think that we need to be extremely conscious of letting business do what business does best, and that is find efficiencies that, in the end, reduce prices, give greater consumer choice, and help an economy to grow.
If I could add a little, I think I couldn't agree more. I think when you look at our supply chains, it's not unusual to see a supply chain that begins in Ontario and ends in Oaxaca. And to the point that Natalie made about the number of times a product will cross our border before it's finally assembled, on average, it's 5 times. And so this notion that you could disrupt that and somehow help the American economy is really predicated on not understanding how this works. If you look at the manufacturing sector, it accounts for 12, almost 13% of American jobs. And certainly in manufacturing, this cross-border bilateral relationship is critically important. Our association is supported by the likes of BMW and Ford and GM and Toyota, and every one of our friends in that part of the manufacturing industry are very concerned over the language that has been used to characterize NAFTA. And so that kind of disruption is harmful. It's hard for businesses to plan if they don't know what comes next. So instability is to American economy and American business what a void is to nature. Nature abhors a void, and American business abhors instability. We must have that instability to continue to plan. If you look at agriculture, again, bilateral trade and exports and imports are critically important. American agriculture accounts for about 11% of American jobs. People's, livelihood is at stake here. There are farmers that today provide the bounty that really is the envy of the rest of the world. Our agricultural sector is second to none. But some of our farmers cannot farm some of their crops in the dead of winter. It's simply impossible because their land may be under 2 feet of snow. So they have relationships with farmers south of the border for the very same crop. And they grow that crop during that time of the year south of the border and bring it to the United States to continue to provide for the needs of the American table. So understanding this correlation and how we got here is critically important. It didn't happen overnight. These supply chains exist because the people providing the products and the goods over time have figured out where it's best to grow something or to build something most efficiently so that ultimately the end product is the best product we can produce. And I think that that's part of what's missing in the rhetoric that's happening right now. And it's our job, I think, to make sure that we continue to talk about it. The role that Deseret News can play is critically important in getting the word out and educating the audience about what NAFTA really means to the average American family and the American economy.
Oh, and Matt, I wanted to just make one other point because agriculture was brought up, and I was asked specifically about this state, Utah. Just let me throw out a couple of factoids that I think will get your mind thinking about this. Unless the numbers have changed, but the last time I looked, we have more hogs in Utah than people. Okay, just think about that, because we have a major agricultural facility in our state that specializes in hogs. Mm-hmm. We also are a big turkey state, and pre-NAFTA, the tariffs for our turkeys were 45%. Mm-hmm. We also have a state that is doing really well economically, but we have a silent recession going on in rural Utah, portions of our state that aren't thriving. And those places tend to be where a lot of these agricultural commodities are. So I just thought that would be a real touch on when you start to talk about changing our relationship with these major trading partners, it's a serious business issue.
Let me ask another question that now will expand, and then we'll get to some audience questions as well. To expand the dialogue somewhat, NAFTA as a model of discussion, but these countries, each represented, do trade with the United States, but also among one another. What can be learned from both the successes and challenges of NAFTA and the current renegotiation that these media organizations can take back to their countries to help shape and inform the dialogue around trade and commerce in their countries? In regional, you've got Mercosur in the south, you've got under different multilateral trade agreements, you've got bilateral trade agreements, but what is it that we've learned or are trying to learn about trade relationships that might be helpful as they shape the conversation?
Go first.
I think what media can do, certainly, you know, it's topical and relevant to cover the commentary coming out of this administration. I think that's certainly necessary and certainly responsible. But I think where you add real value is, again, touching on the facts and bringing it home to your average reader. You know, we look at Mexico quite often, and you know, the rhetoric coming out of this, even at the campaign stage out of this administration, was fairly harsh on Mexico. And while we at the USATC don't turn a blind eye or a deaf ear to the challenges that exist between Mexico and the United States, challenges that have to do with everything from immigration reform to the trade deficit to environmental stewardship. Those are real and they must be dealt with, and I think media has a responsibility to cover that aspect of this relationship. But perhaps even more importantly is to cover the facts around the trade relationship between Mexico and the United States. Every day in this country, $1.5 billion of bilateral trade exists between Mexico and the United States and crosses our unwalled borders right now. 6 million American jobs depend on trade with Mexico specifically. Mexico is the #1 trade partner for 30 of our 50, I'm sorry, it ranks in either in the top 3 trade partners for 30 of our American states. So somewhere it's either #1, #2, or #3 for 30 of our states. And I could go on and on and on with the important data that exists out there. And I think where media can be very helpful is to get at the heart of that relationship and lead with facts, lead with data, so that the average reader can comprehend this issue perhaps a little bit more holistically than they comprehend it now. My fear is that the average housewife in Iowa has no idea of the importance of trade with Mexico and doesn't recognize that Mexico is a #2 trade partner for her state. And so that's the role that I think media can play in educating my American community in the importance of this trade relationship. And when you get that settled, then I think it puts the entire relationship and therefore the entire conversation in a much different light.
Very good, thank you.
I would just add that I think you have an incredibly difficult job because it's enormously complex. We know that in reporting on trade deals, the details are everything. And so I think you have a really hard job because and I'm not an expert at this, but I know how negotiations work. And, you know, this side throws out something outlandish and then this side says something outlandish. And we know that we're seeing that happen. And there's a real temptation to just report on all of the extreme perspectives that are brought to bear in a negotiation. And, you know, maybe you have to do a lot of that, but I think the greater public service can occur when you report on what I'm going to refer to as the productive middle, the place where real problems get solved. So, for example, in the NAFTA work, to the typical American, They've got a president that's talking about, we've lost all these jobs to Mexico, and we're going to get them back, and we need to restore American manufacturing. And as you know, that completely ignores an economic landscape that's changed. And I think for the media to help inform the public, and I'm obviously speaking from a United States perspective, but about the role that mechanization, automation has played in changing how manufacturing occurs, and help them to understand what trade does to benefit an economy. Report on the winners and losers, because there are winners and losers, but help people understand, so what are the policy remedies that can help the people that are hurt by globalization? So in a nutshell, focus on the facts, report on substance, and try not to sensationalize the extremes, because I don't think that's where real positive policy gets made.
Very good. Danny, could you introduce yourself as you stand to the microphone, please?
Hello. Hi. My name is Danny Bahar. I'm an economist at Brookings. I've been thinking and writing quite a bit about NAFTA lately, and I want to push back a little bit, not to ruin the party here, but I want to push back a little bit in the optimism that NAFTA will somehow thrive. I mean, we saw, I think 10 days ago, the closing of the third round of negotiations, third or fourth? Third. Ambassador Lighthizer, I mean, it was a depressive scene. They said, the Canadian foreign minister, she said that some of the offers that have been put on the table are taking NAFTA back 20 years ago. They acknowledged that they're not closing the gap, that it's being harder and harder, that they don't find any ground of agreement. Ambassador Lighthizer keeps mentioning what you touched upon a little bit, which is the obsession, I don't find any other word, of the president with the trade deficit. The US has a huge trade deficit of $500 billion a year, most of it with China. 16 billion is with Mexico, but they're obsessed with the bilateral trade deficits. So I wanted to push back and really try to understand, given your perspective that you talk to all these candidates, like really where is that coming from? Because I do think that there's a very real possibility that NAFTA will be, that the US will pull out of NAFTA, at least judging by what we saw last week, which would have terrible effects in the US economy, as you claimed. And also on the side of modernization of the agreement, that I think everybody agrees that it's an old agreement that has to be modernized, but the gold standard of that modernization is the TPP, which includes digital trade, it includes energy, all the things, which the United States pulled out from already. Mm-hmm. So I do want to push back on that and really seeing also like how can these play out in terms of whether actually NAFTA is going to thrive or not.
You spend more time in Washington than I do, Javier.
Not that that helps any, Natalie, but no, it will work out simply because we don't have a choice. So the media is going to do what you're going to do. Business is going to do what it needs to do. Business will figure this out. Business is bigger than the president. We've seen that in DACA. We saw 700 business leaders in unison get up and walk away from this administration. And guess what? They're going to come back to the table on DACA. This is a difficult time for our nation. But at the end of the day, we have to conduct business. And the media will cover it however you do, unfortunately, mostly sensationalizing it. But at the end of the day, this will be settled because of the economic needs of this nation. That is clear. There is no question as to whether NAFTA is good or bad. Everybody knows that. The president knows that. Now, how he negotiates and the language he uses, well, that's up to him. But at the end of the day, we're not walking away from NAFTA. That's not going to happen because we simply cannot. We simply cannot. You know, the implications to our economy, when we're just now picking up after a slump of, what, 8, 10 years, we're just now picking up. The implications are simply too great. And so we will negotiate this thing. Will it be hard? Absolutely. I mean, look at where we started from. But this notion that we're going to walk away from it, I don't think we have a choice. I don't think we can walk away from NAFTA. What would happen? I mean, what are our options?
I want to.
Certainly this president doesn't have that answer, and neither does anybody around him have that answer. So at the bottom of the day, we got to act like business people. We got to stay calm. We got to continue to negotiate. Is it going to be bombastic? Is it going to be hard? Is it going to? Absolutely. But that's neither here nor there. The fact of the matter is we will make a deal, and we will continue to keep. And by the way, it'll probably get renamed. It'll be called something else. That's irrelevant, whether it's called NAFTA or whatever. And we've always said that maybe the way we should look at this is get away from the North American Free Trade Agreement and go to the North American Fair Trade Agreement. And that's a way that you can maybe name it something that you want to name it and put, after the puts and the takes. But we will renegotiate it because I cannot imagine a world where we would simply scrap it.
I want to just add to that perspective. I came to this panel with some optimism, and yet your points are spot on, right? The things you mentioned are all things that I'm sure Javier's concerned about them. Others are as well. But I loved Javier's quote, business is bigger than the president, and the economy is bigger than the president, and it's going to sort itself out. It could get a lot worse before it gets better, with these rounds.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it'll be extended.
We'll get tweeted about in about 30 minutes here, but yeah. Sure.
But I had 3 reasons for optimism. We've mentioned 2 of them, and I'm going to throw out a third. So one is that broad agreement that it needs to be modernized. So there's a place to go. A second is I have a lot of confidence, this is speaking for my country, but in the people in the federal government who can piece together the details. They're talented people who are committed to our country's interests. The third one, and this gets political, but we do have midterm elections right around the corner. And that's a wake-up call for every new president, is it not? Yeah. It's really hard for a new president to do well in midterm elections, and they're about a year away. And so all of that's going to start feeding into this as this country starts to sort out the very tricky political waters that we're in. But I think overall, elections will help.
Thank you, very good.
Alejandro Aguirre, former president of the IPA. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I have two related questions. From a policy point of view, one of the things that this president has said that he seems to have a preference for bilateral arrangements as opposed to multilateral arrangements. And my question to you is there any real advantage to having bilats versus multilats when you're trying to achieve the goal of growing economies? And the second part of that is, and you mentioned it, he complains about the loss of jobs in the United States due to NAFTA. How do you balance the loss of jobs due to NAFTA with the desire of the American, or the need of the American, or the U.S., we're all Americans, the U.S. Consumer to want to get goods and services as cheaply as possible?
If I might, on the jobs part of your question, again, I think that it's important to lead with the facts. While there is no doubt that NAFTA, I'm sure, cost America some jobs, the reality of it is it created 14 million jobs, many more than it ever would have cost us. And the real reasons, I think, that surround jobs being lost, particularly in the manufacturing sector, have little to do with NAFTA and have everything to do with automation and technology. In a globalized economy, automation is going to happen, and it happened in our manufacturing industry. So as automation increased and robots basically took the place of a human being and worked 24/7 and didn't need overtime pay and didn't need all of the other things that a human being did, the industry did what it needed to do to become more efficient and create better products down the line. So the real, I think, culprit here, if you're looking for that, really is automation and technology, not NAFTA. And there again, it's where media can play an important role in educating the average reader that this is what caused the loss of American jobs. And a counterbalance to that is the fact that NAFTA actually created 14 million American jobs, and I think has the potential to continue to create jobs.
Here in Utah, we have a manufacturing sector that has increased jobs over the last decade, not decreased. So while the United States lost about a third of its manufacturing jobs over the time period I'm thinking about, and some of our large manufacturing states lost even more, in Utah we increased. And we increased because of the types of manufacturing we do, a lot of advanced manufacturing that's not as vulnerable to imports. Manufacturing that requires a very skilled workforce. So I think it's fair to just put out there that place where we can find a real common ground in this country as it relates to these trade agreements is this need to invest in our workforce. And let us go compete with the world, but compete in the ways that we have some advantages. And that would be in our entrepreneurship and in our technology and in our outstanding universities. I think Utah's a great model of that. We've done that here. On your question about the bi versus multi, I think there's people that know more about this than I do that could tell you the advantages and disadvantages to each. But my personal opinion is we have to err on the side of openness. We have to err on the side of having trade relationships with important countries that are open. And the same principles that would apply to Mexico would apply to Canada. These countries that we share such a huge border with, let's open it up and reap the benefits of trade. And we've spoken about them, but lower prices, more choice, and more prosperity because you're growing the economy through efficiencies. I think this is a broad statement, or a big statement, Javier, but I don't think there's anything in the world that has done more to raise living standards than globalization. And then if you come to these countries, openness is really good when it comes to economics.
Very good. Armando, did you have a question? Or Ed first, sorry. Ed and then Armando.
Hi, Ed McCullough. I'm a member of the SIP, the IAPA. Here's my question. I've missed part of this conversation, so you may have covered this. But if there's widespread agreement that NAFTA needs to be reformed, and perhaps this was not covered at all in the last, or very little at the last presidential election, if those are true statements, is it not possible that Trump's it must go now is simply looking for bargaining leverage, that before he was elected, nobody was really talking about in a bipartisan fashion of modernizing NAFTA. And if the Democrats had won, we might not be having this conversation now. Mm-hmm. So if those are more or less true statements, is it not possible that whatever he's saying now he's just seeking leverage?
So I'm a Republican, and so, you know, my party has the House, the Senate, and the White House. And I think you make a really good point, and that is to say that there are reforms that need to be made, and for whatever reason, this showman, this gifted marketer, if I can give the president that compliment, right?
Generous, very generous, thank you.
But he's really good at it. And he's set up the context for some of these things to happen that maybe would not have, to your point. And it's not my style. It's not the way I would do things. It disappoints me. I think that, I'll speak just to the South, but I think Mexico is a vital friend to this country. And it offends me the way this administration has treated Mexico. It's in my party. My party's going to have to figure this out. But I will give the president credit for teeing up the conversation, and it's my greatest hope that the good people around him will get us to the right place.
So Natalie is a white Republican female Mormon. I'm a Hispanic Democrat Catholic male.
You got it. You hit all four. I was going to help you if you couldn't.
We could not be more opposite, but we absolutely agree that this is probably more than anything a good mix of showmanship and a negotiating tactic that seeks to scare the heck out of the guy across the table and then settle somewhere in the middle. The reality of it is that I think the president is certainly intelligent enough to recognize that NAFTA is critically important to this country. Where we end up and what it gets called, it's anybody's guess. But I think he, and certainly to your point, Natalie, the people around him certainly comprehend the importance of the trade that exists between these three nations. So I have hope, as you do, that this is, it's marketing and it's showmanship and it's a bargaining tactic. It's nothing more than that, and that we will eventually get to where we really need to be with a stronger agreement between all three partners.
Thank you. Armando.
Hi, very fast. Last week I talked with Minister of Finance in Mexico. He was telling us about this uncertainty that comes with the negotiations of the NAFTA. But he also explained that the trade percentages that most of the commerce we made with the United States and Canada as Mexicans, that more of 50% of those services or products that we sell are not already of the NAFTA because it was signed in 1994 or 1993. So it says it's not, they are not regulated, and it's okay to have a conversation on which products and how and we develop them. And he said that most of the products are already made with the World Trade Organization of Commerce, World Trade Commerce rates, and that those rates are the same as the NAFTA rates, and so there will be not that much uncertainty. The problem is that in Mexico we have also elections, and there's political horror concepts that are trying to establish, like, let's get out of the NAFTA. NAFTA, it's grown for Mexico, and it's like the wrong equation for economics. That's where all the things, as you are saying, that's the most important thing. If for one side, Mr. Trump is pulling for, let's do uncertainty, a showman and a marketing establishment, and in Mexico with the politics and the, do you see like a big circle of terror or a bad movie or something, drama movie?
Did you say a big circle or a big circus?
Lo mismo.
Because sale igual. Yeah, I think that there's certainly, and unfortunately, I think politics plays into it no matter what side of the border you're in or on. But the reality is that, to Natalie's point earlier, you know, as we examine our own political landscape and what, you know, next year will entail in terms of the midterms, that will play a vital role, I think, as to where we ultimately net out with NAFTA. I think as far as our association is concerned, our work will be focused on working with those senators and members of Congress and reminding them what NAFTA means, A, to the United States, B, to their state specifically, and C, to American small business. One of the things that we forget, I think, is that of the companies that do engage in foreign trade in the United States, of the companies that do engage in foreign trade, 98% of those companies are technically considered small companies. So while we tend to focus on the GEs and the Boeings and the and the Exxons of this world, and appropriately so, they only account for a small portion of the actual trade that exists between our nations. It's actually the small businesses that are doing the bulk of it if you add it up and you look at it cumulatively. And that's why we're engaged, and that's why NAFTA matters so much to my association. When you factor that on top of the fact that if you look at the global market, only 4% of the market exists in the United States. The other 96% of the global market exists outside of the United States. So as a business owner, you want to grow your business. And you look at those two facts, 96% of the market exists outside of the US, and 98% of the companies that are actually engaged in foreign trade are small companies. That becomes a critically important issue for American small business. And then the final piece of this, which I think is very important, is that when you look at American jobs, it's small companies that are producing almost 70% of the new jobs in this nation. Unfortunately for the average small businesses, we don't have lobbying firms that are working, talking to the media or talking to the administration or working Washington, D.C. And that's where an association like ours can say, you know what, never before have we jumped into this, but it's time now to jump in and give voice to the American small business. We're the ones who actually carry NAFTA on our backs. We're the ones who actually create jobs in this country, and we're the ones that this nation looks to for innovation. We should have a voice. We should be listened to, and we will force ourselves into the dialogue and ensure that the average senator recognizes how many businesses we have in his state, how many taxes we pay in his state, how many people we employ in his state, and how many votes we can account for in his or her state. And that's what the USHCC is busy doing these days.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add. I just agree. I just agree with everything you said, and I'll let it stand. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, Gabriela Vivanco from La Hora newspaper in Ecuador. Leaving NAFTA aside for a second, some other Latin American countries also have bilateral trade agreements, and many analysts in the region, in our region, have said in the past that partly the reason why some of the Latin American countries turn to the so-called socialism, and there's many political instability in our region, in many countries in the past decade, and some of the analysts blame that partly in what they call some sort of neglect from the US towards Latin America. And my question is, from your perspective, what is the policy or will be the policy, if any, with the United States regarding the rest of Latin America in the coming years?
Question.
Thoughts on that? I mean, I think that there's a lot of uncertainty in our country right now. It's the world we're living in. And I think that the sort of data-driven, enlightened point of view is to engage globally. And to the extent that the United States has not been engaging productively or in a large, meaningful way with all of the Latin American countries, that's a problem for our country. We need you, you need us. And I think that there are forces in this country that are trying to make that happen. So I can't speak to any specifics other than to say that it's positive when the United States reaches out and establishes very strong, meaningful relationships with countries large and small. You're going to leave it at that?
I'll follow on. It's associated with your question, Gabriela. I think that we have had a hard time looking beyond the southern border of Mexico in many respects for trade and other policy in the United States. And we've seen those who would take advantage of perceived losses in trade and commerce to political advantage. Cuba, of course, for generations now. But Venezuela, we've talked extensively about Venezuela here throughout these past days, and it's a human tragedy. Bolivia has also adopted a much more strident, nationalistic, and populist approach. And now El Salvador is on the brink of tipping pretty tragically in that same direction, and it's not a happy emergence. Ecuador has struggled as well with some very authoritarian tendencies, which tends to be the virus that Latin America gets over and over and over again. Despite many personal freedoms, commerce and other fundamental liberties tend to be threatened regularly, especially freedom of the press. I'm getting to a point here. So this gyration that happens in Latin America, and in many respects the lack of attention that they get from core institutions in the United States has been a problem. What can we do better in terms of U.S. business to be a voice of freedom of commerce, freedom of expression? How can we play a stronger role in this region to invite or put pressure on those countries to return to the regional economy and the regional network of friendships of free and democratic countries?
I mean, I can take a stab at that. I'm a little bit outside of my lane, perhaps, but I think to your question, what can Utah do specifically? I think it's just keep being Utah. You know, it's not lost on me that Utah has earned really the top spot and one of the top rankings for the top economy in our nation. And you look at Utah, and it's competing with places like New York and California and Texas. And I'm a Texan, so it's hard to say that. And at a time when Texas, you know, maybe 5 years ago was the #1 economy, state economy, we're now, I think, number 14. And you look at Utah and you kind of try to figure out, well, what is it that they've got? And what they have is, you know, to the point that Keith made earlier, you have a state that behaves itself in a way that is all about principles and integrity and virtues, I think is what you called them, Keith, of honesty and fair trade, and it welcomes the stranger. And one of the reasons that our association brought our national convention to Utah, obviously because Don Salazar wouldn't let me live it down if I didn't bring it here, but after Don introduced me to Utah and I began to see the miracle in the desert that is Utah, it became very apparent to me that what this state has is its people and the way they treat the immigrant and the way they treat the stranger. Where other states look at the immigrant as a challenge or a problem, Utah looks at the immigrant as an asset and a friend to be embraced and to be engaged. And everything flows from that. The laws, the rules, the regulatory construct, how they treat the stranger. And turning a stranger into an asset and putting them to work and maybe helping them start their business and maybe clearing the path for them to become a citizen faster and become productive is fundamentally different from looking at them as somebody who's not welcomed and is going to be a problem ultimately. And it's that, it sounds simple, but it's not. Because if it was, the rest of my country would be doing it. And I hold up Utah as an example of how we could use things like the Utah Compact as the starting ground, the foundational elements of an immigration reform system that would work for our country. Unfortunately, back to politics, the only thing more broken than our immigration system is our Congress. And so because of political reasons, we played football with this very real thing called immigration reform. And so we struggle trying to figure that one out. And just about everything we're talking about here, at some point or another, gets down to people and how you treat people and whether you trust people and whether you work with people. And an approach that is nationalistic, like, frankly, some of the Latin American countries that are represented here today. Walling yourself off, either physically or ideologically, has never been a good business strategy. You don't grow your business by doing that. And so the same could be said for us because we're dangerously close to being that kind of nation now. And I hope that, you know, calmer heads will prevail. I hope that the rest of America will continue to look at Utah as an example of what you can do and how you can work with each other in mutual respect to build your economy.
I love that Javier said some nice things about my home state. Just to kind of put just a tiny bit of color commentary on this. So I'm jet lagged because I've been on this trade mission with our good governor, Gary Herbert. You know, he took a week out of his time and went to Amman, Jordan, and to Tel Aviv, Israel, and Jerusalem, Israel, and took with him about 40 Utah companies and opened doors for them. Our governor met with King Abdullah in Jordan. He met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Tel Aviv, and he met with the mayor of Jerusalem. You know, we're a little interior western state of 3 million people. And look at what he commanded, right, in doing this. Turns out that we have advanced composite work that's done in Utah that goes to Tel Aviv and becomes part of the F-35 fighter jet. Turns out that we have a cancer researcher at the Huntsman Cancer Institute that has a business partner in Tel Aviv that they're, you know, got some really incredible innovations for cancer. One of our large health systems, Intermountain Healthcare, has a startup that deals with radiology and will democratize radiology in medicine and improve value in healthcare. So anyway, it's just amazing, these connections. And so I love that Javier celebrated the good things that are Utah, and I do think it is a great model for other states.
Thank you. Last question. I think we have lunch coming up, so let's have this be the last question.
Hi. Thank you. I'm Luis Alvarez from Blue Marketing. As a crisis manager, I totally agree with what you said, Mr. Palomarez, regarding the lack of engagement from all the enterprises, all the associations, and it's this goes through from Canada to Mexico. Why are we doing more? Okay, we need to engage a lot more. Okay, engage with politicians, engage with enterprises, companies. They don't know what's going on. Okay, you talk to a CEO and he doesn't know what's going on. And that lack of certainty, because everybody in this room never expected to see Trump become president. I can bet you, I can bet nobody here expected that. So yeah, we might get a surprise. Okay, so what's plan B and why aren't we engaging more with the media, with politicians, with people, telling them about the risks that if destroying NAFTA or renegotiation, even a bad negotiation that could also happen, okay, would affect a lot of lives.
You know, just the thought I would share, and I hope it's responsive to your comment, but a lot has been said about sort of the breakdown of government and the power of business to help with some of these problems. And then you mentioned engagement. I think I would challenge the news industry, the media, to engage. And, you know, there's this old saying in media that it's easy to report the news. It's hard to create a better community at the same time. Is this a saying that any of you relate to? So engagement in these issues can come from more than just reporting the news. You can be a part of your local chamber. You can accompany these trade missions. You can send not just reporters, but you know, publishers or people that are part of the business side of the press. And I just think that type of engagement would be really helpful, because when government fails, it's the responsibility of the people to step up for whatever means they can and make good things happen.
I think, again, you know, I think the point that Natalie made is critically important, particularly in this audience. We get asked every day to opine. We've had calls this morning from major news outlets. And the reality of it is that we find ourselves right now at a place where you know, a good portion of the media is absolutely on one side and believes in a certain ideology, and the other part of the media is on the other side. And the one side won't have you in unless you're going to denounce the president and everything he ever did and every breath he ever took. And the other side won't have you on unless you say he is the greatest man ever, you know, conceived by God. And we're a business organization. We're truth tellers. We'd like to think we are. And so for us, it's not about politics, it's about the facts, and it's about being business people and being as unemotional, frankly, as we possibly can, and leading with facts and with data and trying to let that guide us to the right place. And unfortunately, the media is to blame. Sadly, we find ourselves with the majority of media outlets saying, well, I don't want you on unless you're going to say this about this man. Or we don't want you on unless you're going to praise this about this man. And we're not interested in denouncing or praising. We're interested in talking about the facts and the needs of our constituency, which are American small businesses, not Hispanic businesses, American small businesses. And so therein lies the challenge. And I would throw it right back to you guys and say, we depend on you, the American people. Now the world depends on media. And gone are the days when you report a story and we report a story. Now with technology and the advancement of the media outlets that we have and the power to get the word out, it's critically important. And perhaps the last hope we have is the media to stand strong and tell the truth and continue to drive toward what is a more reasonable depiction of the facts. As business people, we never thought we'd find ourselves here. I don't think anybody thought that Donald Trump was going to win. I wouldn't have bet on it, but here we are. And, we face the specter of having to deal with an administration that frankly denounced our very community. But the options are clear for us. Do you stand on the sidelines and complain from the sidelines? Or do you get in the game and try to change the game from the inside out? And to me, it's very clear. The cards are dealt at the table, and you have to be at the table where the cards are being dealt. You may not like the cards, you may not like the dealer, you may not like the hand you get, but that's the game. And so for us, it's clear. We've got to be engaged. And it wouldn't matter whether Hillary Clinton had won, whether it was a woman, a man, male, female, black, white, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. American business must have a place at the table. We must have open conversation with any administration. But the public depends on the media, and to some extent, as goes the public and public opinion, so does everything else. And so I would push right back to you guys and say, we're depending on you to hold hard and fast to the truth and continue to report from that place. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely.
It makes perfect sense to me, but I don't know, I'm not in the meeting.
Absolutely.
So.
Wonderful. I'll close with just 3 observations from this wonderful discussion and the questions. First is that I think there's a consensus that we hope that trade openness prevails in the U.S. and beyond. And as media organizations, we need to continue to tell the story of the fundamental human freedom of commerce, and encourage that, and fight against the forces that would lead us back to protectionism and nationalism. We've heard very clearly that those are dangerous. And in many of your countries, we've seen the result, and it's tragic. And so we as a region need to band together to make sure that we continue to tell those stories of that freedom of commerce is a virtue. Also, I would encourage you, and I've thought about this quite a lot as you've come here, that I really do believe, my background is economics and public policy, and I really do believe that Utah represents an economy with really no particular natural economic advantages, except its virtues, its openness, and its industriousness. And perhaps stories about Utah that you continue to watch might be told as a case study in your countries, that some of your countries aren't all that much bigger than ours, or that much smaller than, that much bigger or smaller than Utah. And so it might be a case study as you consider effective public policy and perspectives in your countries. We hope that your experience here has been helpful. And please join me in thanking these 2 distinguished individuals for their in-depth thoughts, and thank you for your questions. Thank you. We now have a lunch, and the director of news partnerships for Google will be